So there are two big topics when we are talking about energy and life: photosynthesis and cellular respiration. The two do go hand in hand, but they are two quite large topics with quite a bit going on. So we're only going to tackle one at a time, and we'll really, as we talk about them, talk about how they do integrate with each other. They do form a cycle. So photosynthesis is going to take water and carbon dioxide and turn it into glucose and oxygen. But then cellular respiration is going to be able to take that glucose and oxygen and turn it right back into water and carbon dioxide. So in this lecture, we're just going to focus on the photosynthesis portion of these two big energy topics. So we need energy. The big question is, where do we get it? Autotrophs are organisms that can make their own energy. So they can take sunlight and they can make the energy that's needed. We don't have that luxury, but autotrophs, they get all of their ATP and they get all of their food on their own. If they're hungry, they just make some more food. How they do that is one of the processes we're going to go through is that photosynthesis procedure, that photosynthesis chemical reaction. They use energy from sunlight to produce their food. And organisms that can do photosynthesis, plants, algae, cyanobacteria. So there are some bacteria that can do photosynthesis. And these are really what we're going to be focusing on today, are the organisms that can do photosynthesis to make their own food sources. Heterotrophs are organisms that have to consume their food. They cannot make their own. So they get all of their energy, their ATP, from eating food through digestion and then the process of cellular respiration, which we'll talk about in another lecture. So we are autotrophs as humans because all of our food or all of our energy has to come from food. We can't make our own. This equation, it is an equation to know. Star it, highlight it. So the equation for photosynthesis, there are two things going in and two things coming out. So there are two reactants and two products. The two reactants are carbon dioxide and water. But the whole equation is we have 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water. We add some light energy from the sun, and using that light energy, we can take those 6 carbon dioxide and 6 waters, we can make 1 glucose molecule and 6 oxygen molecules. So plants can take carbon dioxide and water, and using the energy from the sun, they can make glucose and oxygen. Now for the equation, there's a lot of 6's in there. There's 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water, 6 oxygen gases. The only one that's not a 6 is the glucose. It's just 1. I know it's typed on there. If it's not typed on there, it's under the assumption that there's just 1 of them. So where does the photosynthesis equation take place? It does take place in plants, but where? And it does take place in the green portions of the plants. So leaves contain a tissue called mesophyll, and it has concentrated cells that contain chloroplasts. And it's in these chloroplasts where you have a lot of these chemical reactions taking place for photosynthesis. So again, it's going to take sunlight plus 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water to give us 1 glucose, 6 oxygen, as well as some ATP. Now, where does it get carbon dioxide and water? So again, we have to have every component go into the plant for us to be able to get the products out. So the roots are going to absorb water. They can do that and transport water through the xylem as well as vascular bundles, and we'll talk about plants later this semester. The carbon dioxide that goes in enters the leaf through something known as a stomata. Stoma when we're talking about plural. Now, a couple terms that usually that do get a little confusing because they are very similar in spelling is stomata. Sometimes we take off the TA and just have the stoma. Versus stroma with an R. They're spelled super close, but they are different. The stomata, without the R, or sometimes again just called the stoma, is a hole in the leaf. We do have holes at usually the underside of leaves for carbon dioxide to go in. Stroma with the R is a fluid found in chloroplasts, and this is where we actually have the reactions taking place. So that carbon dioxide that goes into the stomata or stoma is going to combine with water in the stroma to form that sugar. And all the energy that is needed to get this reaction going is all supplied by light. Because again, we need energy to make any reaction occur. So zooming in on the leaves and where the photosynthesis occurs, and a couple terms to kind of go over inside of the chloroplast. So we're going to zoom in. Here's our leaf. We're going to cross-section the leaf. We're going to keep kind of zooming in until we get these structures inside the leaves called the chloroplast. And inside of there, we have what are known as grana, which are stacks of thylakoids. So the thylakoid is each individual little circle, and a stack of them is called the grana. I always like to think of it as they look like little Thin Mints. So each Thin Mint cookie itself is a thylakoid, and a stack of Thin Mints is a grana. And the fluid that is inside of this chloroplast is that stroma with the R. Now, an organism needs a chloroplast to be considered an autotroph, meaning it needs a chloroplast for it to be able to do photosynthesis and make its own energy. Now, before we delve deeper into photosynthesis, because it is a chemical reaction, we are going to have energy that's going to get transferred. And generally when energy is transferred, it is the electrons that are moving. And the electrons are carrying energy with them. So we care about the electrons, we care about where they are moving to, because anytime an electron moves, it is carrying the energy with it. And so when we talk about reactions where we have electrons that are moving energy, we call these reduction reactions or oxidation reactions. Now, they usually go hand in hand, because usually as one thing loses an electron, there is something right there to gain an electron. And so they are opposite reactions of each other. And so since they're always found together, we call them reduction oxidation reactions, or we smush and shorten the words to redox reactions. It just means, again, the transfer of electrons from one thing to another. So in a reduction reaction, the molecule that gains an electron is reduced. And that in itself sounds like an oxymoron. How can you gain something but yet then be reduced? Well, it's because of what is gained. When you gain an electron, electrons carry a negative charge to them. And when you are gaining something that's negative, you become reduced. It's almost, if you gained some negative friends, you are overall more negative, you are reduced. The opposite, oxidation, is the loss of an electron. So oxidation involves loss, reduction involves gain. The way I usually try to remember that is if you can remember an oil rig, those things out in the ocean that are drilling for oil. For oil, the letters OIL, oxidation involves loss of electrons, and reduction involves gain for the rig. So kind of, one thing is always going to lose an electron, one thing is always going to gain an electron. So they're always occurring together. Now, anytime an electron moves from one place to the other, it is usually attached to a hydrogen atom. On the periodic table, hydrogen atoms are number 1 on the periodic table because they carry 1 proton and 1 electron. And so when we have moving of electrons, hydrogen can pick up extra electrons and it can carry those electrons with it. Now, when glucose is converted to carbon dioxide, it does lose atoms. And because it loses that hydrogen, it's losing electrons with it. And so it is an oxidation reaction. Photosynthesis is the reverse of that, because in photosynthesis we are actually going to make glucose out of carbon dioxide instead of convert glucose to carbon dioxide. But if glucose is converted to carbon dioxide, it loses hydrogen, it's losing electrons, and so it's oxidation. Whereas in the reverse, if oxygen gains hydrogen atoms, meaning it's also going to be gaining electrons, this would be a reduction reaction. And so that's showing it down in here. If glucose is going to lose hydrogen atoms to become carbon dioxide, we have carbons and oxygen in glucose, but once we go to carbon dioxide, we lose the hydrogens, and we're going to be losing electrons with that as well. whereas the oxygen molecule is going to pick up some of those hydrogens and it becomes water. So we've got these constant reactions that are gaining and losing hydrogens, and in turn are gaining and losing electrons. Now there are things that can easily pick up those electrons and carry them around. Again, as they're going to pick them up, they are going to be picking up hydrogens as well. So we need to be able to shuttle these electrons to different areas to get those electrons and their hydrogen wherever they need to go. So molecules that are easily reduced, which means they can easily gain hydrogen atoms and electrons, are NAD+, NADP+, and FAD+. And when they pick up some hydrogen molecules, they become NADH or NADPH or FADH2. It usually picks up 2 hydrogens. And so it's picking up hydrogens, which means it's going to pick up electrons with it. So these are molecules that just easily pick up those extra hydrogens and easily pick up those extra electrons, because you are going to see these NADHs, NADPHs, FADH2s showing up in some of our chemical reactions because they're wonderful electron and hydrogen carriers and shuttlers. Now, in all of the processes of photosynthesis, this whole 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water with light equals glucose and oxygen, we do break it down in the chloroplast into 2 different types of reactions. Again, we do have 2 reactants and 2 products, and so we're ultimately going to have 2 different kinds of reactions. So in our first reaction, we just call it the light reaction. It's going to take energy from the sun, so you can see sun going into that chloroplast, and it's going to take water and produce oxygen. Because it's taking in that solar energy right there, and it's using that solar energy in those grana, in those thylakoids, we call them the light reactions. Taking water, making oxygen. But if you notice, it's also making a couple other things. You also have a couple other things coming out of those thylakoids. NADPH, it's now carrying some electrons and hydrogen, as well as some ATP. And so we're first going to talk about what really is happening in here to give us that NADPH and that ATP and the oxygen. The other step is the Kelvin cycle. The Kelvin cycle is going to take carbon dioxide and turn it into glucose. Now, if you're like, well, that doesn't have a 6, a 12, or an O like this does, it can really turn this into just about any carbohydrate molecule. Every carbohydrate has a ratio of 1 carbon to 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen, and so glucose has that same ratio. For every 6, there's 12, and then back down to 6. That's still a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, because you could divide these each by 6, and you would have 1 to 2 to 1. So that's why it's not listed specifically as glucose, because there are other sugars they can make as well. So it's going to take carbon dioxide, one of our reactants, and it's going to make one of our products. But if you notice as well, it's going to take that NADPH and ATP that were made over in the light reactions, and it's going to make NADP plus and ADP plus, that phosphorus, meaning it's really going to take the energy from ATP and it's going to take the electron with the hydrogen that was in the NADPH, and then it's just going to recycle it right back over to the light reactions. So we kind of have all of our players. We have all of our reactants between the light reaction and the Kelvin cycle, and we have all of our products as well. Now, is all light, if it's called a light reaction, is all light created equal? Well, no. So there's difference between sunlight, difference between light bulbs. Now, all visible light, so this is light when you turn on a light bulb or go outside, is somewhere between 380 and 750 nanometers in their wavelength size. Pigments that are found in chlorophyll generally absorb various portions of visible light, so somewhere in that 380 to 750 nanometer size. The reason why chlorophyll is green is because it absorbs most of the reds. This is the higher up on here is the more it's absorbed color-wise. It absorbs a lot of reds and it absorbs a lot of blues. What's not getting absorbed by the plants themselves are the greens or greenish yellows. So the reason why a plant is green is because it's actually not absorbing the green, and if it's not absorbing that particular color, it's reflecting it. So the reason why your plants are green is because it is reflecting the green visible light, and it's absorbing every other color. Kind of fun. When we start talking about moving of electrons around, and we have light energy coming in, and it's powering all of these different kind of reactions, a question that we do have to answer is, how do we quantify light energy? We say, well, yes, light energy comes in and it does all of this, but how do we quantify how much light energy comes in? Because there are different quantities of how much light is needed to do particular reactions. So we quantify them as a photon. A photon is a fixed package of light energy. So it's a fixed amount of energy found in light. And each pigment, every pigment coloring can absorb a photon of a given wavelength. And when I'm talking about photons of different wavelengths, we're talking about the different colors and along the different wavelengths that get absorbed. So an electron in a pigment molecule absorbs photon energy, and if it absorbs that photon, that light energy, it's raised to a higher energy level. If you absorb energy, you have more energy, and that's what's happening, is that these electrons that we find in these pigments, these different colors inside the plants, they're absorbing that light energy, and it's raising it to a higher energy level. Now a photosystem is a thing that captures the photons, so something that's capturing those little bundles of light energy and transferring their energy to make chemical energy, usually in the form of ATP or NADPH, one of those electron carriers. So it's really using and transferring the energy that's in the photons to something else. So it's taking the energy that's in the photons, it's taking that energy from the sunlight, and it's making chemical energy, chemical stored in bonds such as an ATP or an NADPH. We're going to take a look at a couple of the photosystems that are occurring inside of the chloroplasts. Things that make up a photosystem. There are two main things. One is that there are pigments. So we do have different colors that harvest energy from light. Examples of some of these pigments: chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, as well as some carotenoids. So these are pigments that are going to harvest the light energy. And if I go back all the way to here, you can really see chlorophyll A, B, and the carotenoids absorbing a lot of the light energy. It also is going to have a reaction center. This is where you now have excited electrons that are getting transferred from the chlorophyll A, from one of those pigments, to what's known as a primary electron acceptor. So it's something that's going to be picking up the energy that's in that electron. And again, we are going to be focusing in on these electron carriers and some of the electron transport chains, because this, with that extra energy, is where you're going to, those extra electrons is where you're going to have lots of energy for things to occur. And I just wanted to kind of do a backwards recall on what actually is going in and what is coming out in a light reaction, so we make sure we get everything covered. So in a light reaction, we have solar energy, we have that light energy going in. Again, it's packaged in photons. We have water going in. We also have going in a DP plus some phosphate plus NADP plus, that came over from over here. So we have water going in, we have sunlight going in, and we have ADP plus phosphate and NADP plus. These are electron carriers that don't have electrons yet. And what we're going to get out, we are going to get three main things out of a light reaction. We are going to get 1, NADPH, 2, we're going to get ATP, and 3, we're going to get oxygen. So we're going to make sure when we talk about our light reactions that we cover and we get each of these three products out of these reactions, because there's a lot going on this slide. So I wanted to make sure that we at least cover what are we getting out, that we get all three of our products out. So what's interesting, I've always found interesting that we have two photosystems here that do work together, and photosystem 2 works before photosystem 1. I don't know why. But photosystem 2, we have water. Again, I'm going to go back. I'm like, we have water going in. So we have water that's going to go in. It's going to go in. Again, we do have to water our plants. And we, with the energy from light, can actually split water. And when we split water, we're going to get electrons. We're also going to get out of the splitting of water some oxygen, which is what we do get out of. It is one of our, I'm going to go back. It is one of our products. So we're going to get some oxygen, we're going to get some hydrogen ions, and we're going to get an electron. So this electron that's going to come out, it is going to get energized from the sunlight. Again, the sun is hitting these pigments. It is helping with splitting this water, and it is energizing these electrons. So if we notice, this particular electron is going upwards, and that's because, as I mentioned before, when it absorbs that energy from the light, it has now become excited. And so it has more energy from absorbing that light energy. Now, this electron, like we've got it all the way up here, it's going to find itself an electron acceptor because it doesn't like to float around by itself very long. And it's eventually going to transfer. That electron's going to transfer all the way over to photosystem number 1. So far, things that we've gotten out. We do have oxygen that we've gotten out, and we have an excited electron. That's about all we've gotten out so far. And again, going back, things we want to get out, NADPH, and we want to get out ATP. So if we notice right here, I have ATP. It's almost like it's its own separate thing that's going on, and the next picture on the next slide, or 2 slides, shows it a little bit better. But all of these hydrogen ions that came out of the splitting of water ultimately are going to be used to make the ATP. And I'll show that on another picture. But we do get some ATP out with the electron transport chain. Otherwise, again, we have an excited electron that is going to go all the way over to photosystem number 1. So we have the photosystem number 2 is going to capture light energy. We're going to have electrons coming from the reaction center right by those pigments. The electron's going to get excited. We're going to keep splitting water from that light energy, and from the splitting of water, we're going to excite more electrons. We're going to get oxygen, and we're going to get some hydrogen. Now, it is that hydrogen, as I mentioned before, that eventually is going to get used to make ATP. And when I say the gradient is used to make ATP, what gradient means is that we have a lot of hydrogens in one area and very little hydrogens somewhere else. And when the hydrogens become very crowded, they don't like it, and so they want to go somewhere else. And as they travel to go where it's not crowded, they will actually generate some ATP. So that's what the gradient is. It's that difference of being very crowded to not very crowded. We're going to jump on our next slide to what's happening in our photosystem number 1. So we have electrons that made it over here. We have a whole nother photosystem. We have more pigments. We still have a reaction center where we're going to have lots of energizing happening from that sunlight. And it's going to take more sunlight, and it's going to eject more electrons from it. Again, it's going to energize them. So we have lots of electrons. We have lots of energy. And it's those electrons plus some of the hydrogens. Not all. A lot are used to make ATP. Plus some of the hydrogens are going to pair up and find themselves an electron acceptor because they don't like to float around all by themselves. And so we now have some NADPH. So things we have gotten out so far. We've made some ATP, and I've got another picture that will show that a little bit better. We have oxygen, and we have NADPH, which is exactly what we wanted. We've got NADPH, we've got ATP, and we have oxygen that has come out. And so this is the picture I like. It's shown it, I think, almost maybe a little bit simpler, but not as detailed. So that photosystem number 2, the very first one, is taking light energy. It's taking water. It is splitting water into oxygen and hydrogen. And this is where you can see you've got lots of hydrogen where they're all super crowded and they don't like it. We excite those electrons. Those electrons are going to go through the electron transport chain. Ultimately, it's going to make some ATP, and then it's going to go over to that photosystem number 1. And that photosystem number 1 is going to give us our electron carrier, our NADPH. So we've got oxygen, we have NADPH, and we are going to have ATP. Now, as I said before, when you've got crowded hydrogen ions, they don't want to be crowded. Instead, they want to leave. This is one of those thylakoids. They're going to want to leave. And they can easily sneak through this particular enzyme. This big orange thing is an enzyme called ATP synthase. Ends in an ACE, most enzymes do. And the job of this particular enzyme, based on its name, is to make ATP. So as the hydrogen ions sneak out, it is going to generate ATP. So we've got ATP, NADPH, and we have oxygen. We've got everything that we need to from our light reactions. And just shown up here again, water went in, there's our water. We have NADPH that came out, ATP that came out, and we have oxygen that came out as well. So just a review of the key players of what's happening so far. We have a photosystem number 2 that's really there for splitting water so we can get some of that oxygen. We have an electron transport chain that's going to be found between the photosystem 1 and 2. It's also going to help some of those hydrogen ions from the stroma into the thylakoid space, so we get that also nice big gradient difference. We get the crowded hydrogens. Photosystem number 1 is where we're going to get our NADPH, so it's now picking up electrons. And then we have that enzyme called ATP synthase that, because we have so many crowded hydrogen ions, they're going to flow through that enzyme and they're going to make ATP. So we've got all of our components so far, at least of the light reactions. So I have this video. We're going to see if I can get it to play audio-wise and line up. And I'm just playing it to about 4.5 minutes because it's gone over so far what we've gone over during this lecture.
In order for plants to grow, they need inputs of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical process by which plants use these resources...
In order for plants to grow, they need inputs of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical process by which plants use these resources to manufacture glucose, the building blocks of plants, is called photosynthesis. In the process, oxygen gas is produced as a byproduct. The energy for photosynthesis originates in the sun and arrives at the Earth as sunlight. This light has both a wave and a particle nature. The particles, or photons, are the smallest units of light. Photons oscillate along a path, which is measured as wavelengths. The light emitted from the sun contains photons in a wide spectrum of wavelengths, called the electromagnetic spectrum. Photosynthetic organisms use only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, called visible light. Photosynthetic organisms contain pigments that facilitate the capture of wavelengths of light in the visible light range. The color of the pigment comes from the wavelengths of light reflected. Plants appear green because they reflect yellow and green wavelengths of light. Red and blue wavelengths of light are absorbed by these pigments and provide the energy that is used for photosynthesis. Within eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, also known as photoautotrophs, the chemical reactions of photosynthesis occur within plant cells in specialized structures known as chloroplasts. Photosynthesis consists of 2 sets of reactions, the light-dependent reactions and the Kelvin cycle. Within the chloroplast are small disc-like structures called thylakoids, which are surrounded by a fluid-filled space called the stroma. The reactions that synthesize glucose, the Kelvin cycle, occur in the stroma. The light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid. It is here that conversion of light energy to chemical energy is initiated. In most photosynthetic organisms, thylakoids contain pairs of photosystems, called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, that work in tandem to produce the energy that will later be used in the stroma to manufacture sugars. The photosystems of the thylakoid consist of a network of accessory pigment molecules and chlorophyll, the molecules that absorb the photons of light. Within the pigment molecules, the absorbed light energy excites electrons to a higher state. Photosystems will channel the excitation energy gathered by the pigment molecules to a reaction center chlorophyll molecule, which will then pass the electrons to a series of proteins located on the thylakoid membrane. Photons of light strike photosystems 1 and 2 simultaneously. We will examine what happens with the photons striking photosystem 2 first. The energized electrons are passed from the reaction center of photosystem 2 to an electron transport chain. The electrons lost by photosystem 2 are replaced by a process called photolysis, which involves the oxidation of a water molecule producing free electrons and oxygen gas. While this oxygen gas is a byproduct of photosynthesis, it is an important input to the cellular respiration pathways. As electrons pass through the electron transport chain, the energy from the electron is used to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma to the thylakoid, creating a concentration gradient. This gradient powers a protein called ATP synthase, which phosphorylates ADP to form ATP. The low-energy electrons leaving photosystem 2 are shuttled to photosystem 1. Within photosystem 1, low-energy electrons are re-energized and are passed through an electron transport chain where they are used to reduce the electron carrier NADP+ to NADPH.
When the
I'm going to stop right there.
chloroplast is
So again, that went over kind of a nice summary, and it's always nice to see things like actually in motion instead of
When
just
the
pictures and listening to me lecture.
Chloroplast is
So we've gotten through so far the light reactions. We've put in sunlight, we've put in some of that water, we've gotten out oxygen, but we don't have everything out yet. So the Kelvin cycle, also happening inside of the chloroplast, is taking care of the rest of the reaction. So we still have carbon dioxide going in as one of our reactants, and we have glucose, some carbohydrate, coming out as one of our products. It's also going to take some of the products that we got from the light reactions and use those. So it's going to take the ATP, that energy that was made in the light reactions, that NADPH, that electron carrier from the light reactions, and it's going to use that to really power this cycle for generating the glucose. And it's the products that it makes then are going to go back right into the light reaction to get constantly recycled. So we talk about how this is reducing carbon dioxide to sugar. And again, anytime you see that word reducing, we are talking about reduction is loss of electrons. And as we talk about this reaction, we're also talking about reducing carbon dioxide to sugar. And because we've got carbon dioxide in, we've got sugar coming out. And when we see that word reduction, we're really talking about gaining of electrons, because reduction involves gain of electrons. And that is partly because of those electron carriers that are coming into the Kelvin cycle. So there are multiple steps in the Kelvin cycle, but as it says, this is a cycle. So we are going to have carbon dioxide coming in. So we have carbon dioxide coming in. It's coming through that stoma, those little openings inside of the leaves, and it's going to meet up with a 5-carbon molecule RUBP. So right away you have 3 of these carbon dioxides coming in, and they're going to meet up with these 5 carbon molecules of RUBP. When that happens, we now, instead of having 3 5-carbon molecules, we have 3 6-carbon molecules. Those carbons got attached here, and we have a whole new substrate. I'm not going to require that you know every single substrate along the way, but at least be familiar with a couple of them if I star them or highlight them on here. Just the note that if we have carbon coming in, this is where it's getting added to. So this 6-carbon molecule eventually goes into something else, and it becomes 3PG. We have 6 of them, and they are each 3 carbons. So what we're ended up doing at this point is we are splitting our molecules. And so this splits. We had a 6-carbon molecule, now we have a 3-carbon molecule. So we split our 6-carbon molecules into half. So instead of having 3 of a 6-carbon molecule, we have 6 of the 3-carbon molecules. We split them in half. And the splitting of these, as they start to turn into other things, but the splitting took some energy. So if you recall, ATP goes in, so we have ATP and energy going in to help split these molecules. This is our activation energy to have this occur. And we also have NADPH. We have some of those electron carriers as well, bringing some hydrogen as well. And that hydrogen is helping make some of these intermediate products as we go from one thing to the next, because they all have a slightly different but similar name. So we have ATP going in, we have NADPH going in, and ultimately we are splitting carbon molecules. Now there is an enzyme that does help regenerate these things to eventually get us right back to a 5-carbon molecule so that we can keep feeding it carbon dioxide. But I really want to, focus on what are we getting out at the end. We get out something known as G3P. And G3P is a pretty generic small building block that is used to make different structures. And sugar and different kinds of carbohydrates is one of the biggest things that it can make. So G3P can easily be made into glucose. But it is a pretty small, simple building block, so it can be used in other organic molecules as well. And I'll give you some examples in just a little bit. So just, focus on this particular slide. We have the carbon dioxide mixing and adding themselves to a 5-carbon molecule, so that now it becomes a 6-carbon molecule. We are taking energy, we are taking electrons, we are splitting that 6-carbon molecule into a 3-carbon molecules. And ultimately, that final product that's going to come out of the Kelvin cycle is known as G3P. And G3P is then used for glucose. So that's where we're going to get that CH12 out, any type of carbohydrate. So the carbon dioxide itself, again, that is going through, I like a picture better than words, but that the 3PG gets reduced to the BPG, BPG is made into that G3P. If you star highlight right here, it's just knowing that we're getting G3P out. And making of the G3P, that's what's coming out at the bottom, is utilizing the electrons and the hydrogens from the NADPH as well as ATP that both came from the light reactions. So the light reactions give us the energy and the electrons we need for the Kelvin cycle. But ultimately, we do have to get back to that 5-carbon molecule, the RUBP. So ultimately, to start the whole thing over, we do have to regenerate the RUBP. And that is going to require some more energy, some more ATP to generate the RUBP. I am not worried about the math, but it's just, where do we get each of the carbons to eventually get back to a 5-carbon molecule instead of a 3-carbon molecule. It's just showing this is a 3-carbon molecule. If we take 5 3-carbon molecules with some ATP, it will make 3 5-carbon molecules. Still the same number of carbon. 15 carbon here, 15 carbon there. It's just a different molecule. Now, as I said before, G3P is the big building block for making carbohydrates. And it is shown right here. It can make glucose, it can make fructose, it can make sucrose, it can make starch, the building blocks that gives plants its structure. So we find it in roots, we find it in seeds. It can be found in cellulose, which is in trunks, roots, and branches, so these plants don't fall over, all based from that G3P. But it's not the only thing. G3P can also be used in making fatty acids as well as amino acids, so making even of proteins. But its general main goal is just making of those sugars and carbohydrates. So I wanted to finish this, and so I'm going to start where we left off.
When the chloroplast is receiving a steady supply of photons, NADPH and ATP molecules are rapidly being provided to the metabolic pathways in the stroma. Therefore, the ATP and NADPH formed during the light-dependent reactions are used in the stroma to fuel the Kelvin cycle reactions. The Kelvin cycle consists of a series of reactions that reduce carbon dioxide to produce the carbohydrate glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. The cycle consists of 3 steps, the first of which is carbon fixation. In this step, carbon dioxide is attached to ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate, resulting in a 6-carbon molecule that splits into 2 3-carbon molecules. The second step is a sequence of reactions using electrons from NADPH and some of the ATP to reduce carbon dioxide. In the final step, ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate is regenerated. For every 3 turns of the cycle, 5 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate are used to reform 3 molecules of ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate. The remaining glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is then used to make glucose, fatty acids, or glycerol. It takes 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate to make 1 molecule of glucose phosphate. Thus, the Kelvin cycle has to run 6 times to produce 1 molecule of glucose. These molecules can remove their phosphate and add fructose to form sucrose, the molecule plants use to transport carbohydrates throughout their system. Glucose phosphate is also the starting molecule for the synthesis of starch and cellulose. Plants produce sugars to use as storage molecules and structural components for their own benefit. By utilizing the energy of the sun, along with inputs of water and carbon dioxide, plants act as glucose factories. Photosynthetic organisms are the primary producers of glucose on the planet. They also produce oxygen gas as a byproduct, and thus serve as the foundation of life, providing food and oxygen for the complex food webs on both land and in the oceans.
How many can we lose and still survive? Well, that's one of the questions we're facing right now as we are destroying tropical rainforests, one of the types of forests that gives us such an abundance of oxygen. So tropical rainforests can exist anywhere temperatures are at least 26 degrees Celsius and above, and rainfall is heavy, meaning they're getting 100 to 200 centimeters a year, and they're usually getting rain quite often, not just 1 or 2 months a year. Most of the plants there are woody, most have vines and epiphytes, and there's really little or no undergrowth. And part of that is just because there's so much rain, they don't need to have really deep roots. And they're just overabundance of leaves and growth above the ground greatly contribute to that carbon dioxide uptake. All that carbon dioxide that is getting generated from us from burning of fossil fuels, these plants take it up and then they provide us oxygen. However, the big old but on here, development has reduced our tropical rainforest from 14% to 6% of the Earth's surface. So we have more than gotten rid of half of the Earth's rainforest. Deforestation accounts for 20 to 30% of all the carbon dioxide we currently have in our atmosphere, meaning we should have 20 to 30% less carbon dioxide in our atmosphere right now if we didn't do deforestation. What issues does this cause? Well, if this carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, it can combine with sunlight and it increases the global temperatures. Everyone's like, okay, so global warming. Yes, it is global warming. However, it's not greatly increasing the temperature. But my note, 1 degree Celsius increase. So not enough that you might not even notice going about your daily life that on average it's about 1 degree warmer outside. But 1 degree warmer temperature globally can have catastrophic effects. It can melt glaciers, which will change the salinity of the oceans, leading to changes of hurricane production. It can cause extreme weather. And this is what we're seeing now. We are seeing more hurricanes. We're seeing more extreme hurricanes. We're seeing weather that we've never seen. 100-year floods are now happening every 5 years. And so a lot of that is proven. They have proved that our carbon dioxide quantity that we have in our air is higher than it has ever been before. It is increasing the global temperature slightly, but it is, which is changing all of our climates. So it's not good. And so we're hoping with enough education, we can instill the needs for all of these plants and keeping them around and decreasing our carbon dioxide generation to a very minimal, hopefully.